Howdy, folks. This is Layman Pascal here on behalf of myself and Bruce Alderman and the whole Integral Stage project in service of the overlapping transformational, developmental, and regenerative meta communities. And one of the things we like to do for those communities is keep people appraised of what's going on in the field, especially when it comes to spiritual and existential work that's occurring in the new flavor of non-dual, full-spectrum, post-postmodern evolutionary culture. And if you survived that last sentence, thank you and congratulations. You might also be qualified for another big sentence, which is actually a big title. The title of an upcoming seminar, spiritual practice session, and teaching event on May 17th and 18th, which is called Always Emerging: 8 Great Matters of the Heart for Our Evolutionary Development and Potential, Exploring the Human Sun Heartwork's Contributions to Consciousness, Character, Culture, and What They Can Mean for You. That's a mouthful, but it gives you a pretty good sense of what the contours of the event are. Clearly, it's a kind of retrospective summary and new addition to some kind of spiritual and consciousness work. Clearly, it's got something to do with the heart and with evolutionary emergence. Clearly, it's going to have 8 major themes, and just as clearly, it's targeted toward you, an individual embedded in their own life and culture and moment. And you might even be able to tell from the phrasing of that title that this definitely has something to do with Saniel and Linda Bonder. So here to help me take a deep dive into this upcoming opportunity is none other than Saniel Bonder himself. Hi, Saniel.
Hey, Layman, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Okay, you and I have talked about your life story before, both on the Integral Stage and on the Soulmakers podcast, so I have a decent sense of the narrative and the stages. Early life, your period as a passionate spiritual seeker with some big name teachers, your calling to re-individuate and re-shamanize yourself, leaving a long-term community, and in the process discovering that you're operating more or less spontaneously as a conduit for spiritual mutations and insights in others, starting to co-teach with Linda, and following a series of unfolding chunks of new dharma, from the waking down to the mutuality piece, democratizing spirituality, the Human Sun Project, and the foregrounding of joy. So, in this big story of constant unfolding, what makes the current event and the current moment of your work different? What's going on here for you that's new?
Well, thanks, Layman. And by the way, you're really good at bang, bang, bang summarizing these things. That's great. And, Linda wants to send you and anybody who's listening her love and blessing. She wasn't able to be here today, but it's very much has been now for over 3 decades, a mutual project for the two of us. And in concert here and there with a wide variety of others, including people in the integral meta meta post post, all that what you said, those worlds. So yeah, I would say that I became excited about this showing up uh, in part. I'll just riff on a few of the kind of themes that to me make this different. There are pieces of what have come through in these 8 great heart matters that some of them have been present in my work from the very earliest time, such as the emphasis on the heart, which capital H is fairly easy to take, but sometimes I feel like I've got to have a smaller EART just to distinguish it from what heart means most often to people, which is typically oriented toward the difference between heart and mind, etc. And this view of the heart is essentially another word for whatever we point to that's all pervading the whole event, the evolutionary, the sustaining, the transformative mystery of our existence that really we share with everyone and everything, everywhere, however aware of that we may be. So that piece is not new, but a piece in relation to it has been percolating for the last several years. And that's more and more of a sense of in effect, that great mystery is the driver here. So, just to get concrete with it, I can't speak of quote unquote my transmission, spiritual energy or whatever, as if I was doing a thing, or for that matter, as if anybody else was somehow, say, by will making some great awakening happen. It seems to me more and more that we get to sense ourselves as privileged collaborators, blessed in many ways, with that greater nature itself. And so you use that phrase self-democratizing earlier. And that's a piece that's been implicit in our work, our Dharma, if you will, for these many years. But it's come into a recognition that that greater nature is itself forcing the issue of what our friend Jeremy Johnson refers to as a kind of a rhizomatic coming forth, an unfolding, a blossoming that's happening in all kinds of ways, in many domains, many people's activities. And for me, some of the other pieces that have come into play here that are relatively new to our own perception, or better to say, expression of it. Where we talk in the 8 Great Heart Matters, one of them is, we call it the Great Split Climb. And it's a recognition, I mean, our work has been called Waking Down in Mutuality for all these years, but why is there any necessity for a direction? What are we waking down from? How do we get there to begin with? And one of the things that's come into our recognition over relatively recent years is it looks like, and this is totally unprovable because it goes back into what's prehistoric and before we were able to record these things. But there's a significant possibility that earlier humanity was much more, we could say, heart-based, whole being, quote unquote, embodied, if you will, though not having gone through the evolutionary emergences that have made us the kind of beings we are. But we've recognized from early on that there's a kind of a waking down of our very sense of being, and how we got up there appears to have been an evolutionary event in our history of losing an earlier, maybe more latent, pre-conscious, to what we mean by conscious these days, disposition that was heart-based, holistic, and gravitated, in effect, up into brain-mind-based senses of where our very sense of being is located. And that may be true not only for people who are obviously more mental, intellectual, but also for others who are more emotional or vitally oriented in their temperament, and of course, including people who have found a calling to gravitate or ascend rather than gravitate down, to ascend into higher, subtle spiritual states of being. So that's a big shift. And another one, in other words, seeing that what we call the spirit matter split that has emerged in our sense historically was also associated with this movement up in us that has left people either transcendentally dissociated or increasingly hemmed in their separate mentality. And of course, that goes to the evolutionary sequence of structures of consciousness, as pointed out by Gebser, and our friend Jeremy is a good advocate for this, where the most recent and most dominant now, the mental rational, and also in some ways quite volitional or will-oriented, is currently where we have become primarily based. And so Another of those great heart matters is what we call the great conflation, which interestingly, given how much attention has been devoted to a deeper developmental understanding of humanity, one of the ways that we describe this great conflation, which kind of is based in that spirit matter split itself, is, as we put it in the write up there on our webpage, it's a mistaking or a conflating, confusing what may well be simply developmental immaturity or unreadiness for or with, confusing that with an existential error, an action, a sin, or a kind of a born given state. So sin, karma, these qualities, and the way that people have tended to address this, what appears to be some kind of existential error, is by proposing to people, you can be free of this, you can outgrow this, you can take steps that, in fact, people may not be ready for. So that conflation then becomes the foundation on which, as we write in there, it's as if our mentors, our elders have been saying to us from time immemorial, in effect, yeah, okay, fine, you're 12, you're limited, but you can be 20. Do this. Why are you resisting? What's the problem here? You're sinning, you're resisting. And that has had a damaging effect, perhaps, on how people approach the whole matter of their own growth. And I'll just mention one or two more, and then we can keep going here. Another one then is what we've come up with more recently that we call the great co-option. And that, as Gebser pointed out in his take on integral, and I happen to favor that myself for these purposes over some of the other maps and so forth, such as Wilber's tremendous work, which informs us in many ways. There's no disrespect intended here. But Gebser makes the interesting point that the currently dominant structure of consciousness, or I prefer to say frequency of being and becoming, because the word structure kind of has too concrete a meaning for me. But the previously or currently and for some time now dominant one has been the mental rational / volitional ? Maybe we could add that. And his point about all of them is that when a new structure or frequency starts to emerge, on one level, it quite naturally resists the new that's coming in. But on another, it also tends to co-opt that. And the potential difficulty there for people in terms of our work is that this has tended to produce a chronic drive or even obsession with what do I do to change, to grow, to awaken, to whatever it may be. What's the practice? What's the action to take here? Whereas from our perspective of our work for many years, a person who's in that kind of hunger, distress, whatever it may be, in fact may already be, and this is then another of the new ways of languaging it, we call it the great fail fall, where that greater heart nature is disintegrating the previous structural basis of our how we proceed in life, and that produces a kind of a death sequence or a dissolution, disintegration. We respectfully call it the rot. And if you're going through the rot, but you're thinking you're doing something wrong, and it's further evidence that you're not responding to the great call to practice better, to do it better, then in effect you're working against your own process, which is that great heart revelation. And I'll say the last thing that I've been saying for some years now, but it appears it's kind of differently contextualized in this framework of the Always Emerging seminar. That great heart nature itself appears to have come through an evolutionary process or be in the midst of one, where one of its first great advocates in modern times, Ramana Maharshi, the sage of India, was very much in the transcendental kind of Advaitic disposition, fundamentally regarding the world and manifestation phenomena as unreal, even though he was a very loving, kind, and great soul. And then more, he was more in the mode of the traditional renunciate, world renouncer. The other primary heart guru or adept who influenced me was Da Frijan Adida, who gravitated more into the great self identity that is, or was himself, is himself, the supreme identity of everyone and everything. And so, in effect, it's the heart realization as the divine monarch. And what we've been seeing in our work all these years, and of course, we're only one kind of, what do you want to say, laboratory of all this. And a lot of them don't use the terminology of heart, but clearly there's an emergence happening that is stepping aside from the previous master-disciple hierarchies and power structures and necessarily finding its way through, I forgot some of your beautiful language there, but it's this distribution, this spontaneous distribution where the centers of power are emerging, in all kinds of ways among all kinds of people. And we appear to be outgrowing the great hierarchy of the one on high who is the supreme being and even existentially superior to everyone else, to an event in nature that potentially has this quickening effect that nobody seems to be in control of, like the little tiny yellow flowers in our overgrown grass in the backyard here. So that's a start, and I realize I went on for a while, but
That's all right. I've got a couple of clarifying points for some of those great matters, but before we get to that, I thought I'd ask you, um, what inspires you to call it the Always Emerging Seminar?
yeah, funny you should ask. Um, my first couple of books, White Hot Yoga, The Heart, and Waking Down, had breakthrough in the subtitles of both. Breakthrough Way for Westerners, Breakthrough into the Sanctuary of Mutuality. And that language could be defended, I think. The argument could be made. But Linda and I realized, we don't want to be in the position of, in effect, having to prove a claim. So then we thought, well, what about simply even making it a question? Make the title Something New, question mark. But we felt that that was almost too much on the other side. And we just simply wanted to acknowledge what's pretty clear to everybody looking around, that something is emerging and something always has been. If you look at humanity as having kind of popped out in these last few thousand or hundreds of thousands of years in the long display of life on Earth. And so that always emerging quality is something that we feel doesn't need to be proven. But then when you look at this particular work. Human sun heart work is another name that's relatively new for our work here. That orientation, that activity of ever new dimensions showing up, always evolving could be another phrase, similarly perhaps descriptive. Does that answer your
Thank you.
question?
Yeah, that's great. You mentioned a little bit about the heart, right? The heart in distinction to just the human emotional intelligence capacity. But what I noticed on the website around the first module or principle is this phrase that the sun in your heart is rising.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious about the associations you had with this sense of rising.
Yeah, well, thank you. In that sense, actually, I think we use that more in the metaphorical sense. A better way to say it, maybe that's more phenomenological, if you wish, is the one great intelligence, energy, form making, and an inhabiting principle of our being is coming alive and awake all the time, in and as and through every body. And so there's an intensification of this principle of our existence that became very prominent for me in the early years of my quest, and then announced itself in a more emphatic and obvious way in an awakening that occurred in the early 90s and has continued to refine and evolve, not only in my life, but in that of many others who, Linda and I and others who became our colleagues, have been able to help with all this. So the sun in your heart is rising is pointing to a principle. Just recently, I came across a magnificent quote from the great American Christian mystic and really universal sage, Thomas Merton, where he says, at the center of our being is a point of nothingness, a point of pure truth that's blazing, got this heavenly blaze to it. That's in everybody, and the gate of that heaven is everywhere. And that's a nice nice way of saying, a helpful way of framing the same thing in different words. That nature is in fact, as we talk about, and this was made clear through my training and my time of my seeking, but then became vividly obvious in my own awakened service. It's seated in the heart of everybody. So, this truth isn't merely out there. Yeah, it's that too, but it's intrinsic to us, and it actually is giving us life and consciousness in every moment. And it's also the evolutionary driver here. So that's the meaning of the sun in your heart, SUN, rising.
Thank you. The third principle, the great split and the great climb,
Mm-hmm.
is very interesting to me because there does seem to be this sort of anti-mortality, anti-nature, anti-feminine, even anti-identity move in a lot of the spirituality from the last few thousand years. But how do you distinguish between reactive movements of ascending and escaping from the ongoing work of growing and changing, right? For like this sort of overly volitional, overly mental culture, from the actual need to develop intentionality and use the mind better. Because there does seem to be a necessity for an ongoing work of change. And if that's not the movement of ascending and escaping, then how do you see those compared to each other?
Well, thank you. Let me see if I can make sense here in a response to that, because it really is kind of uh, a fulcrum we've somehow got to navigate on here. Um, I really appreciate you bringing this up, because to make a critique of we could say mental rational obsessiveness, volitional obsessiveness, uh, is not to dismiss the necessity for mind, will, cultivation of the capacity of directing our attention where we wish, acting on that attention and intention. That kind of cultivation of these facets, faculties of our nature is extremely important. So there's a distinguishing that takes place between a process of being so oriented in those ways that we're not feeling a deeper plane of PLANE of being. There's a dissolution, disintegration, disenchantment that takes place, we could say, in that plane of being that meanwhile is coinciding with, even very important to us activities of not only self-growth, but cultivation of resilience, uh, cultivation of ways of staying strong and confident and fundamentally joyful in the midst of even extremely challenging and ominous and difficult events. So there's a both and here, where we don't lose the skills we've developed. And in fact, going through this whole being awakening process, that greater nature actually, if anything, over time, empowers us further to make use of mind, will, attention, etc., for the sake of, as Ken says, wake up, show up, wake up, clean up, wake up, clean up, grow up, show up. There are a lot of things to do in all that, and it involves our whole being and all our many aspects of our participation in the world. So I don't know, let me ask, does that respond to your question?
No, that's great. Yeah. I don't want to have this go too long, so I'm not going to ask all the follow-up questions that I thought of.
Okay.
But
Well,
I
feel
was
free to ask a
curious
couple
around.
more if you want.
Pardon?
I said, feel free to ask a
Okay,
couple more if you want.
that's right.
We don't have to have a gong go here.
I'll do two more. One is around the great fail and fall, and
Yeah,
whether you see um, sociological versions of that happening on sort of the culture and political stage of the world. As
absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Was there more to the question, or should I go ahead?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean that's to me that's what's happening. It's a good umbrella phrase or term sociologically. What's happening in the collective, the entire collective of humanity. So much of it appears to me to be, in effect, a great fail on the collective level. That is dropping us into stark realities that we would really rather not have to encounter, deal with, get through. And in that sense, without sugarcoating and going in a la la land, oh, it's all just the divine taking place here. But at a deeper level, it appears to us that, yeah, that's what's happening. And it makes for a curious mix, in the later modules there, the Great Heart Reveal and the Great Heart World, as this greater nature, if indeed it's coming alive and awake, it's not going to be stopped one way or another. It might be apparently slowed down or distorted for a while or whatever, but it makes for me, a curious mix of short-term extreme sobriety about our prospects, but longer term, however, maybe way long term. Maybe it's actually more like millennia than generations, say. It seems to me that humanity is on a course to evolve into an extraordinary sensitivity and wellness of being that becomes pretty much naturally, culturally, the foundation and shared basis of our living, which doesn't mean we won't have arguments and so on and so forth, but will make us a much wiser and more empathic species as a whole. Um,
Well, speaking of that, uh, future blossoming and the great heart world vision, one of the things that caught my eye on the website was a phrase around the great heart world. I wrote it down here. Vital lived paradoxes of the simultaneity of spirit and matter, God and flesh, heaven and earth, sacred and profane, and so on will abound. And I thought that's a pretty interesting feeling of the future. It's not traditional spiritual utopian feeling where it's just peace and love and safety. It sounds more peculiar, more exciting, more novel, more ambiguous and coherent at the same time. I wondered if you could say a few more things about this world that's blossoming and overflowing with living paradoxes.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think an increasing emphasis on that is another of the, it's not exactly new, but it's congealing in some new ways here. I'm really glad you picked up on that one. That that quality of paradox is one of the signals of, in developmental terms, a quite profound individuation that is at the same time, here's one of the great paradoxes, using the developmental language of James Foster, because that's his name, Stages of Faith, is that there's individuation followed by conjunction. And so one of the realms of great paradox is the dance between standing forward that much more fully as who we are in our identity and working a process in communion with others, recognizing that what we've awakened into, self as world, is also other as world. So the simultaneity of selfness and otherness is one of the great domains of these paradoxes that we then have to find our way to manifest in the midst of and discover what our unique path may be in any moment. And it includes recognitions that, like the old Chinese proverb or Silk Road proverb of who knows what is good and what is bad. You know, the old story of the young man who finds a horse and then loses it, and his father keeps saying, "Who knows what is good and what is bad?" And that becomes more and more prominent, and that capacity to live in the both ends of things being both positive and negative, having challenges that at the same time are obviously blessings, becomes unavoidable, actually, for people who gravitate into this kind of quality of, in some ways, a divinely human world, but not looking like our traditional perfectly blissful ever after utopia, whether it's conceived in only spiritual or total spiritual and material terms. I'm not sure I did justice to that, so if you want to ask more, take more, please do.
I think that's probably enough for at least this recording.
Okay.
Um, where should people go if they want to sign up for this seminar or find out more about it?
Yeah, go to Saniel and Linda, and that's Saniel like Daniel, but with an S, Saniel, And, Linda, Linda, sanielandlinda.com/always hyphen emerging. sanielandlinda.com/always hyphen emerging.
And I
And
get the sense that although the seminar is wide in terms of who it welcomes in, that you've got a special emphasis that you've had in your work for a little while now on um, facilitating the facilitators and helping the people who are looking to play a role in furthering this process of unfolding.
very much so. And in fact, thank you so much so that for Linda and me, we've gone through a variety of changes over the years of our work organizationally and so forth. And it became a curious, to me, at the time, it seemed quite obvious that the way that heart nature was driving us made it necessary to, in effect, find a way to serve others in exactly the manner you're talking about, and to not assume that the people we're here to serve, best here to serve, are interested in or needing something like a traditional community of belonging, what we refer to as the real community of our work at this point, which includes some of our former colleagues and so forth, um, is loosely knit, KNIT, yet deeply heart connected. And in particular, it's the change makers. It's the entrepreneurs who are here to, do good and do well. It's the healers, the transformers, the folks for whom living untrue to their purpose or not being able to discover their purpose is not acceptable. So yeah, thank you. And I should just
Well,
quickly add,
yeah,
we
go ahead.
also have, as you referenced earlier about joy, we have an offering called Maximizing Joy that's more intended to also reach, along with those folks, to also reach people who are simply looking to lighten the stress and brighten their spirits and be able to cultivate, greater wellness of being and to achieve what they're looking to do. So it's not that we're only here to serve the people who know themselves as serious transformers.
But there is a special service for those people who, yeah, are moved in that way.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for this conversation. I've known you a bit for a while, and my sense is there's something intriguing about this particular offering. As a sense of a summing up and an opening of a next phase, but also of a clarifying of something that many people have been involved in. And I sort of am imagining you gathering yourself for a particular transmission, both verbal and nonverbal, that will be of benefit to a whole field of people who are growing into this new sensibility. So I'm excited about that. And anybody who's listening who's like, how is this any different than any other thing that Saniel's ever provided? I can't totally answer that, but it feels a little different to me, this one. So thank you.
Yeah,
And thank both you and Linda for your ongoing work of, I don't know, just how I love how nuanced you both are about the ways in which the subtle, the non-dual, and the human are seamless together.
thank you. Yeah, that seamlessness, simultaneous with all the differences, that's one of those vital lived paradoxes. So, thank you, Layman, and may it be so. At this stage of our lives and work, we very much look forward to meeting and being able to serve whoever may be attracted.